the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, August the 25th, 2024. We've just come off one of the most consequential weeks, I think, in American political history, certainly recent history. Of course, this week, the Democrats held their national convention in Chicago at the United Center, which is, of course, promoting United Airlines, for better or worse. And in many ways, there were a lot of sports at the DNC, at the convention. We, of course, had Steve Kerr, the current coach of my local team in San Francisco, trolling Donald Trump, as many of us are wont to do. We also had the virtual appearance of Steph Curry, San Francisco's most favorite sportsman. But there were other sporting illusions or metaphors, not just concrete ones like Kerr, who played in Chicago, now coaches in San Francisco. There was Joe Biden's farewell speech. It kind of reminded me of a final appearance of a sportsman, a sad, emotional event. And of course, there was the appearance of the new star, a certain Kamala Harris, who is now chosen as the star of the Democratic Party. And there was a quality, a sporting quality, even it was a formal political occasion at the United Center. Lots of chanting, lots of wonderful photographs. This sporting connection has been picked up by my guest today, Frank Andre Guridy, a historian at Columbia University, who has a new book out, very interesting book, very timely, The Stadium, An American History of Politics, Protest and Play. And Frank is joining us from the Upper West Side of New York City. Frank, congratulations on the new book. Timing, of course, Frank, is everything. Did you have a word with Kamala about all this so that your book would come out at the same time as her appearance?
Indeed, I did. You know, I have her number and she has mine. No. I did not. It was just a nice convergence of things for the book to come out during the election season and during the week of the Democratic convention. So in some ways, it's just good fortune.
You're a historian. You're an expert on historical narratives, contemporary narratives. Have contemporary Americans' sense of the narrative of sports and media and politics, are they collapsed? Of course, Donald Trump is an expert of that, turning politics into soap opera or reality television, or maybe reality television into politics. Are we at a point now where sports is politics, is media?
Yes and no. Yes, because as you alluded to in your opening remarks here, we see the usage of sport metaphors all the time in political discourse, right? We saw it during the convention. You did mention Tim Walz, right? Tim Walz, one of the things that makes him an appealing
candidate. I meant to include that. I forgot the coach.
Right? He was a football coach, and the day he gave his speech, I mean, I think his former players came out on stage, and then of course he used a lot of football metaphors in his speech. So there is that, right? And there's a symbolic role that sports plays in American culture. But then there's this sense that sports and politics should be separate, right? Especially when marginalized peoples start to bring their political concerns to the local stadium or the local arena, right? And in some ways, you saw that also during the convention, when those who were advocating for the Palestinian people and for a ceasefire in the Gaza war, they were closed out completely from the arena, right? And so, or when athletes stand up for racial justice, as they did in the 2010s or in the 2020 year after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis that summer, a lot, and Colin Kaepernick, the athlete activist from 2016-17, right? So when they engage in politics in the sporting realm, then a lot of people get upset, right? That's not seen as legitimate, right? So I think that But I think I would argue that these things are always entangled, right? And they're entangled whether we're talking about conventions or they're entangled when you're talking about the building of your local stadium or arena.
Doesn't it depend? I mean, it depends on two things, obviously, Frank. Your own perspective. For some, Kaepernick, you mentioned him. He's a hero. For others, he's the villain. Back in '68, when a couple of African American athletes made quite radical civil rights gestures, clenched fists and so on in Mexico City, they were vilified by some and treated as heroes by others. Today, almost 50 years later, they seem heroic. So doesn't time and perspective always influence this as well?
Of course. Yeah. And I think the more outward participation of athletes or coaches like Steve Kerr, that's really a consequence of the movement for Black Lives over the last 10, 15 years, right? I think there's a way in which in 2020, I think the idea of shut up and dribble, right, which some conservative pundits have used to try to...
Who used that? I haven't heard that one. Who used that?
That was Laura Ingraham, right? And talking about LeBron James, saying he should just go out there.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so, I think that attitude, while still pervasive, I think it has been repudiated in a lot of ways because our country's become more polarized politically, right? And I think it's a lot more difficult for athletes to stay out of the fray because these elections just feel ever more consequential, right? Whether it's 2016 or 2020, or of course now this year 2024. So I do think there's been a bigger space open towards athletes participating in politics, especially in the mainstream realm, like we've seen here when it comes to supporting a certain candidate, for example.
Some of Kamala Harris's critics have suggested that she just waved to the camera. She's a very photogenic woman, and she did very well on camera, but she never actually said anything. Of course, the same can be true of Trump as well, a master of the camera. Is there a connection, Frank, do you think, between this merging of sports and politics and the relegation of ideology? People don't expect Harris to stand up and talk about capitalism or reforming the welfare state or dealing with the Russians or the Palestinians or the Israelis. They simply want someone to either vilify or fall in love with.
I think you could say that for sure. I mean, I think there's a way in which U.S. political culture has radically transformed. I mean, if you watch the Nixon Kennedy debates from 1960, very famous, one of the debates that actually helped inaugurate the kind of tradition of televised debates, right? And you watch what those candidates are saying. I mean, you're stunned at how detailed their policy positions were, right? Now
and how respectful of each other's they've. Jousting ideologically.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. There's a real emphasis on decorum, and that's been broken, and that's one of the legacies of Trumpism, but it's also about how politics has changed, right? And how these conventions are very much a show. I mean, I think that, unlike the sporting event, which has a lot of choreography, right? What happens on the court or the pitch or the field, that's sort of subject to chance or subject to the skills of players. There is a kind of element of improvisation. Whereas now in U.S. political culture, everything is super choreographed, right? And super staged, and the kind of spaces for in-person interaction that go off script have been minimized, right? I also think that's just a consequence of post 9/11 securitization in our society. There's ways in which there's a real emphasis on controlling what people do when they gather in a certain space, right? And how our surveillance apparatus has really developed, radically since 9/11, right? So I think some of this is a consequence of, corporatization. Some of it is a consequence of how our society changed after 9/11. And I think that's affected, mainstream U.S. politics in profound ways.
Thinking out loud, Frank, I wonder whether everything's been reversed. As you noted the Kennedy-Nixon debates in 1960, where they were very respectful of one another and of each other's positions. And actually, they weren't ideologically that far apart. They were very different kinds of characters. And of course, it represents the beginning of a televised culture. Back then, sporting events tended to be rather bloody, disrespectful, huge fights on the pitch, whether it's American football or ice hockey. Today, there's, and I think some sports fans, perhaps including myself, find it rather irritating. There's a little bit too much respect in sports, and the reverse is true of politics. There's all the hate gone out of sports and been turned into politics in America today?
Wow, I wish I really could answer that question in an authoritative manner. I will say that U.S. sporting culture has changed. Partly. I mean, you use football. I'm going to use the U.S. football example as a good one because of the. Now we have a greater sense of the absolute dangers that football players face on the gridiron, whether it's brain trauma, let alone all the other injuries. There's a real emphasis on sanitizing the violence. Whereas, again, if you watch, a televised broadcast of a NFL game, even 10, 15 years ago, before the knowledge about brain trauma in football became more widespread. I mean, we would celebrate the glorious hit. We would celebrate we would celebrate those sorts of things. And they are not celebrated now. I mean, there is I think a much better culture of safety to some degree among these players, right? Or especially in a sport like football. So yeah, I do think some of that has been tame. I mean, I think if we're in a European soccer context, it's very different. I think.
Well, but in Europe, it's the same.
Is it? Yeah.
You used to have a lot of football hooliganism.
Right.
It still gets played up a lot, but it doesn't really exist.
Not in the same way.
And the players are much more respectful. In the old days, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s in the UK, there were always massive fights on the field.
Yeah.
Between the players, lots of violence off the field or in the stands. And also referees were much less involved, so you could get away with a lot more. These days, it's the referees. Maybe that's our surveillance capitalism in practice in politics.
I think you could say that. I mean, certainly, one of the things I talk about in this book are the ways in which, when the stadium was much more, articulated as a civic memorial space, as even though many of these buildings are still owned by the public, even though they're dressed up as, temples to worship of the corporate gods. The stands were a lot more violent in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s than what we see now. There's a kind of more of an emphasis or a tolerance of expression in the stands. And again, much of that has been very, carefully controlled for, under the guise of safety. But I think there's been a consequence of that. And it really has, trampled a lot of the improvisatory aspects of politics and sports, I would say.
Frank, you're a historian at Columbia. You were recently appointed, congratulations, the new executive director of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. So you focus in some ways on race. In America, which of course, more than anything else, is riven by racial conflict, racial violence. How much of this is reflected in your history of the stadium?
It's a central theme in the history of the stadium, I would say, among others, right? I think that what the stadium does functionally is that it becomes a space where the status quo is shored up, is celebrated, and it's a place where the status quo is challenged, right? And one only needs to look at the Jim Crow stadium, the college football stadium or the baseball stadium during the Jim Crow era in the South to see the ways in which white Southern segregationists use that space to not only keep African Americans out or keep them carefully segregated in certain sections and then keep them off the field, but also to celebrate the Southern legacy going back to the Confederacy and slavery, right? The sanitization of the plantation past, the celebration of the Confederacy and Confederate flags. You see this over and over again in the pregame and halftime pageantry of one of the most important college football traditions that exists to this day, the Sugar Bowl Classic, New Year's Day Classic, which I talk about in the book, right?
Yeah, so, that's at Tulane.
That's right. Exactly right, right? A stadium that was supplanted by the Louisiana Superdome, but for 40 years, it was the kind of the main athletic facility in New Orleans, and it really was about the staging of the White South's aspirations for a national audience, right? Because the Sugar Bowl Classic was broadcasted on radio and television, as it is to this day, and it became this space where the South almost feel like the reconciliation, the kind of restaging of national reconciliation after the Civil War, which is predicated on the subordination of African Americans, right? So that's certainly a part of the story. The story of the desegregation of sports also is happening in the stands. But it's also happening from a gendered standpoint, right? One of the things I talk about in the book, too, are the ways in which women sports writers were able to kind of break into the journalism guild in the 1970s, spurred on by the feminist, second wave feminist movement, and the ways in which they're fighting to get into the press box in the locker room to cover sports, right? So it's a long, attenuated process, but it shows you again that for many people, the stadium is a space of work. And in terms of gender equity, it became an important place for civil rights and gender equity activists to make those claims, right? And so it's a place where we battle out our social questions, whether it's race, gender, or even sexuality, as I talk about also in the book.
In a funny way, then, talking about politics and sports and stadiums and political institutions, the old Sugar Bowl, which you write about in the book, which was a way of, in Jim Crow America, to legitimize the Old South. It came to Washington, D.C. on January 6th with people proudly waving Confederate flags. Was there did the Congress, the Capitol, become the old Sugar Bowl for a few hours?
You could argue that. And it also resembles something else that I talk about in the book, the 1939 German-American Boone Rally and celebration of Nazism, in which was a celebration of George Washington's birthday, right? In Madison Square Garden, where this gigantic display of George Washington was displayed in the middle of the arena. And these Nazis are making all kinds of claims for the elimination of Jews and African Americans from American political culture. And so there you're seeing this harmonizing of fascist right-wing politics with American patriotism, right? And I think that's sort of what you saw on January 6th, right? The ways in which the right wing, certainly over the last 40, 50 years, but even more explicitly lately, has really kind of merged things like fascism, merged things that we associate with the Confederate South into this, their brand of American patriotism, which is why it was interesting to see how the Democrats were really trying to reclaim patriotism, take it away.
The USA chant.
The USA chants, and the emphasis on Republicans in the who were defected from the party. And even a Walls-like figure, even though he's progressive, I mean, like in some ways, he's somebody who you could argue, really corrals certain concerns that, we associate with the Republican Party, even though he's not a Republican, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think January 6th is an unfortunate, part of the legacy of slavery and racism, and even the ways in which fascism, morphs into something new in the 21st century.
I want to get to the way in which perhaps the Republicans use stadiums and politics and sports differently from the Republicans in a minute. But you mentioned Madison Square Gardens, one of the great stadiums in American history, in 1939. But there was a famous, and you know this better than I do, Frank, a famous fight between Joe Louis and the Nazi favorite, the German Max Schmeling. I think it was in 1938. And as one historian notes, it was the first time that whites and blacks cheered for the same boxer. And Lewis said something like, well, they cheered for me even if they were part of the Klan. What began to change in the 1930s with professional, high visibility, world championship quality sportsmen like Joe Louis?
Joe Louis and Jesse Owens, who I'll also talk about too, right? Who, captures gold medals at the 1936 Olympics. Where? In Berlin, right? Nazi Germany, right?
Of all places, right?
Exactly right, right? And so, I mean, there's an example right there of a stadium that was, in some ways built to sort of showcase the glories of a regime. And that's certainly what Olympia Stadium was built to do in Berlin, right? And then here comes this black athlete who's disrupting the ideological project in his way of the Nazis, right? So absolutely, like Louis and Schmeling fight twice in the 30s. They fight in 1930. The first time is 1936 when Schmeling beats Joe Louis, and then Schmeling becomes a sort of hero of the Nazi regime. And then the rematch in 1938 when Louis decisively beats Schmeling. Both of those fights happened not at Madison Square Garden, but at Yankee Stadium, just up the road.
Oh,
right?
I apologize.
No. I wasn't correcting you. I was just introducing another historically consequential building, Yankee Stadium, right?
The old Yankee Stadium.
The old Yankee Stadium, right? Exactly right? 70,000 people are cheering Joe Louis, knock out Max Schmeling. And it becomes this major victory that showcases not just the achievements of a black boxer, but, symbolically is a blow against the Nazi regime, right? And it was seen as such at the time when many people were advocating for, boycotting of Nazi Germany and opposing Nazism, across the Atlantic world. I mean, the 1930s is such a fascinating moment in U.S. and world political history. That's the understatement of the century. And you could track so much of that in America's stadiums like Madison Square Garden and Yankee Stadium, where sports and politics are coming together in very interesting ways, and where a building like Madison Square Garden becomes a political meeting hall where there are constant rallies of all sorts of types, of Communist Party rallies, Socialist Party rallies, labor activism, immigrant activism, and then right-wing politics, all fighting it, fighting amongst each other at Madison Square Garden in the 1930s. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things I wanted to talk about in the book, to showcase, the role of these buildings that we associate with sports. They have a hugely consequential role in American politics.
What about the architects of these stadiums? Today, they seem to be sometimes designed by committee. I was mentioning to you before we went live, I was in New York this week. I had a walk in Flushing and walk past the Mets Stadium. And all these baseball stadiums, they all look the same. I mean, sometimes they're in different locations. So the San Francisco Giants Stadium is by the bay. It's a fantastic location, but the stadium's no different from Flushing or any of the other stadiums. Who creates these things? Do you look at the ideology, if you like, of architects and architecture?
Not the ideology, but certainly the influence of architects is profound, right? For much of the 20th century, there was a company called Osborne Engineering, which was based in Cleveland, which designed many, many, many stadiums in this country, including the old Yankee Stadium, including Cleveland's Municipal Stadium, including Notre Dame Stadium, including Michigan Stadium at the University of Michigan's campus, right? Like they designed and built many, many, many buildings, right? And if you look at their structures, they're state of the art for their times, but they're very much, they're not built for exclusivity. I mean, sometimes they had tiers, sometimes they did not, right?
So they were inclusive, or designed to be inclusive.
Much more inclusive. I mean, if you look at most of those structures, absolutely. I mean, there's no emphasis on building exclusive seating, right? I mean, obviously tickets that are closer to the field cost more, but there's very little sense of social stratification, which radically changes with the advent of the luxury box and the luxury suite, which starts with the Houston Astrodome in 1965, but it becomes standard practice by architects from the 1990s forward. So if you look at a company called HOK Sports or Populous, they are the dominant architectural firm in much of stadium construction over the last 30, 40 years. They design many, many of them, and their bread and butter designs are really designing these smaller ballparks that at least the baseball stadiums, that really showcase these VIP sections, not just in these stands, but also around the field, kind of premium seating. And the seating capacities are smaller. And so they really do cater to a more affluent crowd. And that's how they're conceived of now. They become these sort of enclaves of exclusivity instead of buildings that are designed to cultivate more cross-class, and I would even say cross-racial interaction.
My wife's a big American football fan, Frank, season ticket holder at the 49ers. And she's very nostalgic for the old Candlestick. She doesn't like the new stadium. I'm not sure she would quite put it in your terms, but I know that you think that the old stadiums like Candlestick, I went a few times, the weather there is appalling and it's a hard place to get to. But it's a more democratic place than these new corporate stadiums with their exclusive boxes and their incredibly expensive tickets. Is that fair? Was there a moment, the 50s and 60s and 70s of when the stadium was most democratic?
I do make this somewhat controversial claim that I do think the mid-20th century stadium was much more democratic, mostly because of historical timing. Because what you have happening in the 50s and 60s, right, is the influence of the civil rights movement, right, which is radically changing U.S. society in many corners, but especially at the stadium and in the sports world, right? Whether it's Jackie Robinson or the influx of Black players in all the major sports, right? You're also seeing, again, the impact of second wave feminism, which is also transforming sports from a gender standpoint, right? So all of this is playing out at the mid-century stadium, right? And so you've got much more diverse crowds coming to events, right? Not just sporting events, but concerts, like the Wattstax concert in Los Angeles in 1972, which is a celebration of Black soul music, but also Black power. Like the Fania All-Star concert that happened in Yankee Stadium in 1973, which was a showcase of kind of the Puerto Rican and Afro-Caribbean community in New York, right? So the mid-century stadium, even when they were located in suburban context, drew a wider array of people to them than what we tend to see now, right? And that's because of the fact that those buildings were dovetailing and actually became theaters for the showcasing for new America that's emerging in the 1950s and 60s, right? And so that's why I make that argument. So it doesn't matter to me that aesthetically, those buildings were not as, I guess, as attractive. Many architectural historians will argue, or baseball enthusiasts will say that they weren't very attractive. They were brutalist, modernist structures, but they certainly, helped catalyze a radical social change in American society that you don't see now. You don't see it in the same way. In fact, you often see, as I say, like these buildings have become, totally exclusive spaces there, where it becomes much harder for people who are not of elite backgrounds to access to them.
But it's more a reflection of neoliberalism, which of course isn't particularly colorblind or gender blind, but as long as you have money, you can buy the boxes. You're not going to get turned away if you're black or female or gay, are you? No.
It doesn't operate in the Jim Crow sense. But it is interesting because, again, if I might pick on that New York example once again, I talk about this in the book. If you go to Yankee Stadium now, compared to when you went to, I'm old enough to have gone there many times when I was growing up here. There's a New York Times article in 1976 that's about the new Yankee fan. And the new Yankee fan was a Puerto Rican, who had come to New York from the island and cheers "Vamos, vamos" from the bleacher seats, the cheap bleacher seats, right? You're very less likely to see Latino or black fans at a Yankee game. You're going to find them either on the field laboring as athletes or as concession workers. So, the Yankee crowd has gotten way more whiter and affluent, and not because of Jim Crow policies, but because of the ways in which neoliberalism becomes racialized in certain contexts, right? So it's a striking contrast between the Yankee crowds of yesteryears as opposed to what you see now. Now, if you go see other events there, for example, when NYFC, the soccer club, was playing there, that crowd is very different, right? It looks a lot more representative of what New York is than what you would see at a Yankee game now, right? And so, you don't have Jim Crowism in the same sense of legalized segregation, but in some contexts, they do have racialized implications when you create this kind of stratified society. You saw that also in Baltimore at Oriole Park at Camden Yards when Freddie Gray was murdered in police custody, and you see a predominantly black and cross-racial crowd descending upon Oriole Park at Camden Yards, and in the crowd, it's in the stands itself, is a predominantly white crowd, even though Baltimore is a predominantly black city, right? And so there are contexts where you see this racial dimension in very interesting and intricate ways.
What about the exclusionary nature of these new stadiums when it comes to generations? I know this is happening in the UK in particular with football. Is when I was growing up, anyone could go. It was so cheap to buy a ticket. Now these tickets are so expensive. It is in the new stadium. Is it a way of not allowing children to experience the live event, or at least kids from families that can't afford these ridiculously high prices?
It's interesting. I haven't thought of it that way. I mean, I think that might be one effect of the kind of the class stratification you now see at the American Stadium today, right? Where certainly, families just can't go unless you have serious income, right? So that's definitely been a consequence. I don't know if that's by design, but I do think, the consequence of the gentrification of the American Stadium is that, absolutely. I mean, again, my father was a Dominican immigrant who came here, working class New Yorker, and going to games is a regular thing, right? And he did not have a high paying job. He was just your average working class New Yorker, and that's just not the case. I mean, he would take all of us, my brother and I and my mom, and that's a dynamic that really has become narrow to the affluent crowds of those who live in America's cities today.
Frank, I live up the road from Kezar Stadium in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. I know you write about the role of Kezar and the emergence of, quote unquote, the gay games. How important has the stadium been, not just in the racial, in civil rights revolution, but also in the sexual and gendered revolutions? Yeah,
one of the I'm trying to find the right words. One of the challenges and one of the most joyous moments I had writing this book was writing about the gay games, and because I really want the reader to understand that those social changes that are being inaugurated in American society are, certainly the Black freedom struggle is central, right? But there's other movements, and really it's the late 70s and 80s where you see the kind of, the influence of the gay lesbian movement for rights, and even more radical for liberation. And you see that in San Francisco in the 80s. When Tom Waddell and a host of other organizers who were athletes, wanted to showcase gays and lesbians and queer folks of all types on the playing field. And they created the kind of counter Olympics in 1982 and it becomes this extraordinary event for that community. And they're able to do it again because Kezar Stadium was a public institution that was accessible to a wide swath of San Franciscans. You know, that building had been the home of the San Francisco 49ers for 25 years. But when the Niners leave in 1971 and they go to Candlestick, right, that becomes this interesting neighborhood stadium, which it had always been, right? It almost becomes like this countercultural space where Led Zeppelin and the Grateful Dead and anti-war rallies are happening there in the 60s and 70s, you know, against the Vietnam War, and then the gay games, right? And so, you know, it becomes a genuine community institution. And that event was consequential for that community, especially as the AIDS crisis was starting to descend on the United States and on gays and lesbians in particular. And so it becomes a major event, and it shows, as many of the people in the oral histories have talked about, the power of the scene of gay and lesbian queer athletes parading around that field out for everybody to see, coming out of the ballpark instead of doing it at the local bar, which had been the, you know, was, and, you know, the kind of central institution in gay lesbian life. But in this case, they're bringing it out in public, in creating their own sporting event, and becomes monumentally significant for that community in the 1980s.
Frank, I'm sure you were watching the Paris Olympics with not just the interest of a fan, but as a professional historian, having written the stadium. I think this week or next week, there are the Paralympics, which, of course, they're not just an American phenomenon. How does the Paralympics, though, play in your narrative?
It's interesting. I don't talk about the Paralympics in the book. You know, one of the challenges with this book, especially as a book that's trying to be sweeping in its scope, is to you know, live with the pain of leaving things out.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things I had to leave out. I mean, I think the Olympic movement becomes really important in the advent of stadium construction in Europe and in the United States. And one only has to look at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, a building that was built pretty much designed to house the 1932 Olympics. And it helps actually bring the Olympic movement from Europe to the United States. And the 32 Olympics, you know, by all accounts, is a successful event. And it helps spawn, right, and grow the movement. And it creates things like the Paralympic Games, which we now see today, right? And so, you know, if we look at, you know, world stadiums and stadiums like the Coliseum and others, you know, you can sort of track the influence of the Olympic movement in creating this international sporting spectacle.
Let's end, Frank, with the future. Donald Trump is very active in his stadiums. The Republicans had their convention in Milwaukee. I'm not sure where was it in Milwaukee? It wasn't in a stadium, was it?
Yes, it was. It was the arena, the Milwaukee Bucks arena.
Okay, so I mean, are the Republicans and the Democrats, are they basically trying, for better or worse, to create the same narrative, or is Trump doing something different, both in Milwaukee and particularly in the numbers of events he seems to do? Of course, he was almost assassinated in one of these events.
Yeah, I think that they are doing. There's some similarities there, right? The choreography of these events is that's not particular to one party, right? The kind of making sure that everything's on message and minimal dissent and minimal distraction. I think that's just contemporary American political politics, right? Regardless of your party. But I think when you look at the Trump rallies, I mean, they do resemble sort of what I talked about in the German American Boom rally at Madison Square Garden in the 1930s. I mean, there's this chilling but interesting trans-historical phenomenon of, you know, patriotism and right-wing politics merged around a kind of charismatic demagogic figure. And that's what you're seeing with Trumpism, right? Whether it's at, in some rally, whether it's at the convention or whether when he shows up at college football games in the South that he likes to do over the years. I mean, there's this interesting kind of demagogic aspect that's unique, I think, to Trumpism that you don't see with the Democrats. The Democrats are trying to kind of create a carefully controlled message of inclusion that is, choreographed for sure, but it's not centered on a kind of, as much as Kamala Harris is the central figure right now, but there isn't a demagogic quality to Democratic political culture that you see with the contemporary Republican Party.
So Harris, of course, as you say, is the current star, although she hasn't sort of pretended to acquire a Trumpian cape. How's the best way to fight it? Is it, you mentioned Kaepernick earlier, he was a football quarterback, but now on his Wikipedia page, he's described first and foremost as a civil rights activist.
Yes.
Megan Rapinoe, former professional soccer player, is also extremely political. Is the best way to take on this Trumpism, this nostalgia for Madison Square Gardens, as you suggested, in 1939. Is it best done by politicians like Harris or sports people like Kaepernick and Rapinoe who have turned political?
Yeah, I mean, you need them all. You need everyone. You need the politician for sure. You need the athlete who has an audience to take up the causes of the progressive social movement, as the Black athletes and Megan Rapinoe and other non-Black athletes did in 2016, 17, into 20, into the present. But really, at the end of the day, you need the social movement to push those issues to the fore, right? And I think that's the piece that's really important. I mean, I say this as a social movement historian who looks at the impact of the civil rights movement and other movements on American political culture. You need people pushing from the outside. You need those people outside the United Center pushing for a ceasefire, right? Because if you don't have them out there, then the ceasefire question doesn't come up at all at the convention, right? As it did because of the people who are lobbying on behalf of Palestine, for example, right? So, that dynamic is critical. You need that movement to push the politician and the high profile.
Yeah, but we know why that didn't, for better or worse. And it's obviously an incredibly complicated issue, but the reason it didn't come out is because it wasn't allowed to come out.
Oh, exactly right. No, you're exactly right. Absolutely right. But the pushing is necessary. I mean, I guess that's what I'm saying. And it was necessary in the Atlantic City Democratic Convention when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was trying to push the agenda of civil rights workers, during the convention when Lyndon Johnson gets to be nominated as Democratic president, right? So, I mean, there's long histories of this dynamic in American political history. And I think we've seen over the years that you need all of these factors at work in order to create the political and social change that people want.
Well, Frank Andre Guridy, you have made the stadium a central piece of American political folklore with your new book, An American History of Politics, Protest and Play. I know you're not so much of a sports fan now, but you grew up as one. What's your favorite stadium?
Hey, hold on. I am a sports fan now. I might work on sports, but I still love sports. Don't get me wrong. But my favorite stadium is the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. It's now basically the home of the USC Trojans football program. But really, if you look at the history of that building, it hosted so many consequential events in world stadium history, whether it was the Olympics, but also, political history, the 1960 Democratic National Convention, graduations, the Dodgers, the UCLA Bruins, everything happened there. It became the most important space for Los Angelinos for 50 years or more. And it's still there to this day. And it doesn't have the same impact, but nonetheless, it was a single-tiered facility. It didn't have luxury boxes until recently. So it's one of those places that's iconic and historically significant and often gets overlooked, I would say.
Can I step on the sea?